Her name was Sophie, though most people on the streets of Los Angeles called her by different names depending on which shelter or church she visited. At 19 years old, she was homeless, sleeping in youth shelters, abandoned buildings, and occasionally parks when the shelters were full. Her entire life had been shaped by loss and the relentless search for belonging. She had never known her parents. Her grandmother, Rosa Maria, had raised her from infancy in a small apartment in East Los Angeles, working as a seamstress, loving Sophie with a fierceness that made up for the absence of everyone else. Sophie's grandmother had been her entire world. She had taught her Spanish and English, had told her stories about their family's immigration journey, had shown her how to sew, cook, and find beauty in small moments. Grandmother had been her safe place, her rock, the one person who would always show up. Grandmother had promised that they would always have each other, that family meant something, that love could survive anything. Sophie had believed her completely. She had built her entire sense of self around the certainty of grandmother's presence. Then Sophie turned 18, and her grandmother died. A sudden stroke, unexpected and devastating. One day grandmother was there, teaching Sophie how to make tamales, and the next day she was gone. Sophie had no other family. No parents. No siblings. No aunts or uncles or cousins. She had only ever had grandmother, and now she had no one. The apartment was gone within weeks, bills unpaid, eviction notices ignored because Sophie was too broken to respond to them. She had ended up on the streets with nothing but a backpack of clothes and the memory of grandmother's voice telling her to be strong. For the past year, Sophie had been surviving on the streets of Los Angeles, living in youth shelters, working part-time jobs when she could, trying to figure out how to exist in a world that suddenly felt completely empty. She had tried reaching out to social services, but they were overwhelmed. She had tried finding housing assistance, but without documentation or family, she didn't qualify for most programs. She had tried attending school, but it was hard to focus on homework when you didn't know where you would sleep that night. She had thought about giving up many times. She had stood on bridges and wondered what it would be like to just let go. What kept her going was a small box. A box that grandmother had given her before she died, with instructions to open it only when she truly needed to remember that she was loved. Sophie had kept that box with her through everything, through sleeping in parks, through nights in shelters, through the loneliness that threatened to consume her. She hadn't opened it yet, but knowing it existed, knowing that grandmother had left her something, kept her going. It was proof that someone had loved her. It was proof that she had mattered to someone. It was her anchor in the darkness. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning while sitting in a community center using their free Wi-Fi to look for job postings, Sophie had seen the listing. An abandoned van in Los Angeles was being auctioned off by the city for $5. The listing included a photograph of an old 1980s Volkswagen van, weathered and broken, sitting in an impound lot. Something about the van called to her in a way she couldn't explain. Maybe it was because vans represented freedom, mobility, possibility. Maybe it was because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. Maybe it was because deep down, she still believed that grandmother was guiding her towards something meaningful. Sophie had $5. $5 she had been saving from collecting cans and doing odd jobs. She went to the auction with her $5, sat in a plastic chair in a government office, and bought the abandoned van. When they handed her the keys, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time since grandmother died, she felt like maybe she had found a place to call home. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The van was parked in an impound lot on the outskirts of Los Angeles. When Sophie went to pick it up 2 weeks after the auction, she almost turned around in defeat. The vehicle was a complete wreck. The paint was faded and peeling, showing rust underneath. The windows were clouded and cracked. The interior smelled like decades of abandonment mixed with mold and decay. The tires were flat. The engine wouldn't turn over. Everything about it screamed brokenness and abandonment. And looked at her new possession, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. This van was hers. She had bought it with her own money. It was hers to claim, hers to rebuild, hers to make into a home. Nobody could take it from her. Nobody could tell her to leave. She had something that belonged to her completely. That first night, Sophie slept in the van parked on a residential street in Los Angeles. It wasn't comfortable, the seats were torn and the temperature fluctuated wildly between hot and cold, but it was hers. She wasn't in a shelter surrounded by strangers. She wasn't in a park vulnerable to whoever might pass by. She wasn't dependent on the kindness of institutions or charities. She was in her own space, her own property, her own home. It was a beginning. It was a start. Over the following weeks, Sophie worked on cleaning out the van systematically and carefully. She removed decades of accumulated garbage, broken belongings, and debris. She scrubbed and cleaned every surface with dedication. She tried to make it livable, comfortable, safe. She brought in blankets from the shelter. She created a small space that felt like home. And as she cleaned, she discovered things. Personal items left behind by the previous owner. Forgotten memories of whoever had owned this van before. Clothing, books, scattered photographs, broken items that had meant something to someone once, but it was in a hidden compartment under the driver's seat that Sophie found the treasure that would change everything. A locked metal box, small enough to fit in her hands but heavy with significance and years of accumulated history. She had to pry it open carefully, not wanting to damage what was inside. When she finally got it open with a screwdriver, her breath caught completely. The box was filled with jewelry. Rings and bracelets and necklaces, some elegant and obviously valuable, some simple and clearly loved with decades of wear. There were photographs accompanying some of the pieces, old photographs, black and white and faded color prints showing people wearing the jewelry, celebrating moments, capturing memories of happier times. There were handwritten notes describing where each piece came from. Wedding ring from my mother. Bracelet my father gave me on my 21st birthday. Necklace from my first love. Each piece of jewelry was a story. Each item was a memory of someone's life, someone's love, someone's precious history. Sophie held the jewelry box in her lap and cried for hours. Because she understood what this was. This was someone's entire life, their most precious possessions, packed into a van and then abandoned. These were keepsakes that had meant everything to someone. These were pieces of jewelry that had been worn during important moments, that had been close to someone's heart during celebrations and sorrows, that had represented connections and love and memory across generations. She thought about grandmother. About the small box grandmother had given her. About how grandmother had understood the importance of keeping memories close, of holding on to the things that connected you to the people you loved. And Sophie realized that she had been given a second chance. That somehow, in buying this abandoned van for $5, she had found not just a home, but a responsibility. These keepsakes needed to be cared for. These memories needed to be preserved. These stories needed to be told. Sophie carefully photographed each piece of jewelry with her phone and each photograph in the collection. She researched the pieces methodically, trying to understand their history and value and meaning. She created a detailed inventory documenting everything in the box with notes about what each item represented. And as she worked late into the nights in her van, she felt grandmother's presence with her, guiding her, approving of the care she was taking with someone else's precious memories. She felt like grandmother was saying, "This is your purpose now." Over the following months, Sophie spent every moment she wasn't working researching the jewelry in the box. She carefully photographed each piece with professional lighting. She researched jewelry hallmarks and maker's marks. She contacted antique dealers and jewelry experts to understand the age and origin of each piece. She scanned all the photographs and created digital archives. She transcribed the handwritten notes, preserving the stories written in someone's careful handwriting. Was that this jewelry box contained pieces spanning over 70 years. Some items were from the 1930s. Some were from the 1950s. Some were much more recent. Each piece represented a different era, a different moment in someone's life. There were wedding rings that had been worn for decades. There were childhood charm bracelets. There were anniversary gifts. There were pieces that someone had treasured enough to keep forever. Sophie created a detailed database documenting every piece. She included the photograph, the handwritten note, her research about the piece, and notes about its estimated age and value. Some pieces were quite valuable, gold and silver with gemstones. Some were costume jewelry from different eras. But Sophie realized that the monetary value wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the human story behind each piece. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of selling the jewelry collection, which would have made her financially secure, Sophie decided to try to find the people these pieces belonged to. She began the painstaking process of researching the names mentioned in the handwritten notes. She looked for death records, birth certificates, and family connections. She posted carefully in genealogy forums and online communities. She reached out to people with matching last names. She became a detective, searching for the families these memories belonged to. The first person she found was a woman named Margaret Torres. Margaret had been mentioned in a note attached to a vintage bracelet with the date 1952. Sophie tracked down Margaret's family through genealogical research. When she finally contacted them, Margaret's granddaughter answered the phone and began to cry. Margaret, she said, had passed away 3 years ago. She had often talked about a bracelet she had lost decades ago when a family friend had borrowed her car. The family had always wondered what happened to that car and to all the things Margaret had left inside it. Sophie arranged to meet with Margaret's family. When she handed them the bracelet, carefully cleaned and preserved, along with the original note in Margaret's handwriting, they wept. Margaret's daughter held the bracelet in her hands and said, "My mother talked about this bracelet every single year on her birthday. She said she hoped someday to find it again. She wanted to pass it to her granddaughter." Sophie had made it possible. Sophie had found Margaret's treasure and brought it home. That experience changed everything for Sophie. She understood her purpose now. She was meant to reunite these keepsakes with their families. She was meant to be a guardian of memory. Over the next year, Sophie worked relentlessly to find the owners of the jewelry. Some searches led nowhere. Some items had belonged to people who had passed away long ago with no family to trace. But for many of the pieces, Sophie succeeded in finding families. She found a man named David whose father had left him a watch in the jewelry box with a note, "For my son, so he will always remember that time is precious and family is everything." She found a woman named Patricia whose wedding ring was in the collection, lost decades ago but never forgotten. She found a young girl who received her grandmother's necklace, an heirloom that had been missing for 10 years. Each reunion was emotional and profound. Families cried. People expressed gratitude that went beyond words. Sophie realized that by preserving and returning these keepsakes, she was healing wounds that had never properly been closed. She was returning pieces of people's hearts that they had thought were gone forever. But Sophie also realized something else. She couldn't just return the jewelry and move on. She wanted to tell the stories behind each piece. She wanted to preserve the memories. She wanted to honor the people whose jewelry this was and the people who had loved them. So Sophie made another decision. She started a business. Sophie created The Keeper, a jewelry restoration and storytelling service. She would take in broken jewelry, antique pieces, and sentimental items. She would carefully restore them to their original beauty. And she would help people document the stories behind their jewelry. She would interview customers about their pieces, record their stories, and create beautiful documentation that could be passed down through families. She transformed her van into a mobile jewelry restoration workshop, complete with tools and lighting and a small workspace. Word spread through community centers and churches. People began to bring Sophie their broken jewelry, pieces they couldn't bear to throw away but couldn't afford to have professionally restored. Sophie worked on each piece with reverence and care. She learned restoration techniques from experts. She invested in proper tools and supplies. She created a system for documenting the stories behind each piece, but more importantly, Sophie discovered that helping others preserve their memories was healing her own grief. As she worked on Margaret's bracelet and David's watch and Patricia's ring, she was also working through her own loss. She was honoring her grandmother's memory by creating a space where all memories mattered, where all love was preserved and respected. At the same time, Sophie enrolled in college. She studied art history and jewelry design, wanting to deepen her knowledge and expertise. She worked on her jewelry restoration business part-time while attending classes. She became passionate about the intersection of art, history, and personal narrative. She understood that jewelry was more than just decoration, it was a form of human connection across time. Today, Sophie is 24 years old. She still lives in her van, but it's no longer an abandoned wreck. It's her mobile studio and home, carefully organized and filled with the tools of her trade. She has built The Keeper into a thriving business that serves her community. She has returned over 100 pieces of jewelry to their rightful families. She has helped preserve countless stories and memories. She has also done something unexpected. She finally opened the box that her grandmother had given her. Inside was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting, written before she died. The letter said, "My dearest Sophie, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. I want you to know that you are not alone, even when it feels that way. You are surrounded by love, not just my love, but the love of all the people whose lives have touched yours. Please remember that your life matters. Your existence matters. Your ability to care for others matters. Find your purpose. Find your people. Build your legacy. I love you forever. Abuela." Sophie cried when she read those words. Because her grandmother had known. Grandmother had understood that Sophie would find her purpose not in wealth or security, but in preserving the memories and stories of others. Grandmother had known that Sophie's journey would lead her to create something beautiful and meaningful. Sophie bought an abandoned van for $5 when she was homeless and broken and had lost everyone she loved. What she found inside was a responsibility and a calling. What she created is a service that reunites people with their memories. What she discovered is that by honoring other people's stories, she was able to honor her grandmother's memory and heal her own broken heart. Every time Sophie restores a piece of jewelry or reunites an heirloom with its family, she thinks about her grandmother. She thinks about the small box grandmother left her. She thinks about the fact that grandmother understood that Sophie's greatest gift was not her ability to create beautiful things, but her ability to preserve and honor what mattered most to people. She thinks about legacy and love and memory stretching across time. That if you believe that memory is sacred, that preserving stories matters, and that sometimes our greatest strength comes from helping others preserve what they love, subscribe to this channel.